Hey guys, so it's me, Nicolette Mashile, also known as the Financial Bunny. Welcome to the best month in the year. It is, of course, September, and we are in the middle of Wills Awareness Week. And I just thought, you know what? Let's do a video speaking a little bit about the importance of drafting a will. Now, please remember that none of my videos constitute as financial advice. If you are, however, looking for financial advice, please do speak to somebody who is certified and registered with the FSCA. So what is a will? I always say the decision to write a will is basically you making the choice as to which law will distribute your estate upon your death. So basically, if you write a will and you have a valid will, your estate will be distributed according to the law of succession. Simple. But if you do die and you haven't drafted a valid will, your estate will then be distributed using interstate succession law. It's really that simple, and I think that's the core of really drafting a will. But I think in traditional content that we create as content creators, especially within the finance education space, we always stress the importance of drafting a will because you don't want to be an angry ghost. You want to make sure that your assets are going to the right people. When you die, your property, your money, your cash, your wealth, whatever it is that you have, your clothes, your artifacts, your sentimental stuff, your personal items, you want it to be given or inherited by the people that you intend to inherit those items or that property. But I do think that it extends a little bit further than that. And I think that a will is a strategic estate planning tool. It is important to understand that your entire estate basically constitutes of what is called your deemed property, your assets, ownership or legal ownership over certain assets that you may have. Or for instance, if you've got policies that are paid by you or are due to you upon your death, right? So think about things like share certificates, right? That is legally yours, you've paid for it. But also think about insurance policies that maybe you've been paying for and they are due upon your death, or a death benefit within a retirement fund, right? So those are essentially still your assets, even though you do not have the actual ownership of that asset right now in your hand. So it's not a tangible asset, it's an intangible asset. It may be a paper asset, right? So all of that property is going to make up your estate. But your estate is not just made up of your assets and your deemed or property. It's also made up of your debts. So let's say, for instance, you have a car that has still got an outstanding balance on it by a financier. You still owe that financier or that credit provider that amount of money. So essentially, when your estate is being wound up, all of those things are going to be taken into consideration. So when you are setting up your will or writing your will, what are some things that can be considered so that you can make sure that you are drafting a will that speaks to the type of financial future you either want to secure for yourself and, of course, for the people that you leave behind? And I think the first one, and probably one of the most important one, is thinking about liquidity. It's important to understand that there are going to be fees that are going to be paid out of your estate upon your death, right? Things like paying SARS, the estate duty fee. That needs to be paid off to SARS, right? So there is an accumulated estate duty that you're going to pay based on the size of your estate. Then there's also, of course, executor fees, 3.5 plus 6% of income that needs to be paid to the executor that you have appointed to help you in distributing your actual assets. So that means that the estate must have the cash reserves that should be in there to be able to pay these types of fees. Let's say you are put in a situation where you are forced to maybe sell certain assets or certain properties. There may be capital gains tax that needs to be paid by the estate. So all of these things need to be taken into consideration. And what often happens is that a lot of people have assets-rich estates where they've got a whole lot of assets that are tied up in real estate, tied up in share portfolios, tied up in cars, tied up in gold, but they are not actually liquid, so they're not cash. However, there is a need for cash to be able to settle certain things within the estate upon your death. So what you can potentially consider is to keep some cash reserves, or you could potentially look at an option of talking to a financial advisor about taking up a life insurance cover or policy that can come and create that liquidity within your actual estate. So that's consideration number one. The second consideration that you've got to remember is that in private retirement funds, rather, let's look at the Pension Act, right? The Pension Act has a clause or a section called 37C. And basically, Section 37C of the Pension Act talks about how your retirement death benefits will be distributed, right? And it gives the trustees of the pension fund certain powers in terms of how do they determine who then gets your death benefits, right? So yes, you do write a beneficiary nomination list when you're sitting with HR, or if you call your pension administrator, you can write that beneficiary list. However, the trustees will have the final say in terms of looking at your dependents that you leave behind and then determining how much of your death benefit will be allocated to each dependent. And this is now only applicable to retirement funds, provident funds, pension funds that are within the private sector. I want to say private sector because funds like the GPF or municipal retirement funds are not included, right? So as long as your fund is a private fund, so a private retirement fund, an RA, it probably is got a section, the Section 37C of the Pension Act will be applicable to that fund. And this is important because a lot of people say, but what if I write my own nomination list or my own heirs inside my will? No. Section 37C will trump the will because the Pension Act says that the pension benefits, that those death benefits do not go into the will. So the beneficiary list is just a guide for the trustees to know where to start. So some considerations that you can make is that while you are still alive, make sure that you are keeping that nomination list updated. So if you've got a life event that happens in your life, maybe you've got a new child, add the person in there. If you've got a divorce, make those changes. If you've got children outside of your marriage and they are your dependents, add them in there. If you've got maybe a niece or a nephew that you are paying for, or your sibling that you are helping out financially, add them to the nomination list so that they can also be considered and there isn't a delay in distributing those death benefits of yours, right? So this does not go into the will, and it's important for you to remember that. The next one is executor fees. Now, as I started this video, I did make a mention that it is Wills Awareness Week. So there's going to be a number of financial institutions that are going to be putting out campaigns that speak to come and draft a free will. I want you to read the clauses and the terms and conditions of that drafting of a free will, read them and understand what they say. Because often or not, what happens is that some of these institutions will say they're drafting your will for you for free, right? But the condition is that you are going to nominate them as your executor. And sometimes they will charge that full 3.5% plus VAT plus 6% of the income when it comes to actually finalizing this process of winding up your estate. So it is best that if you are going to use them, and I'm not saying don't use them, I'm saying if you are going to use them, make sure that you know, try and negotiate those executor fees up front. Try and negotiate for a co-executor with somebody in your family that you trust and somebody who's got some level of financial and business acumen so that your executor fees are kept to as minimum as possible. Right. The next one is, let's say, for instance, you've got young children, and if you pass away, none of us know when we're going to pass away, right? So it's a bit of a difficult one, and that's why we say personal finance decisions today will essentially secure your tomorrow. And if you delay it, and something happens before you've actioned that decision or that money move that you wanted to make, it may be too late, right? So if, let's say, you've got young children or you've got children that are your heirs, and upon the age of 19, you pass away, or upon the age of 18, you pass away, or they turn 18 a year after you pass away, and all of a sudden 5 million needs to be given to them. You know, that sometimes makes it difficult because young children are not accustomed to managing finances. They could be getting excited. It's their first, second year in varsity. They want to buy a lavish car. They want to get a lavish apartment, and they want to do all sorts of different types of things. So the considerations you can make here is creating a testamentary trust that comes out of your actual will. And in that testamentary trust, you can then potentially put in some sort of age or milestone restrictions or conditions to say your child will get the first 5 million or the first 2.5 million when they turn the age of 25, or if they graduate, whichever one comes before. And then when they turn 30, they can get 500,000 rand to use as a deposit for their first property. And then by the age 40, they can get the rest of that money. So at least you've got a little bit of control while you are under the grave, right? The next one that we can potentially think about is marriage regimes. Before I move on from the trust, it is also important that you make sure that the trustees that you are nominating and you're appointing on your child's trust, right? These are people that can manage the assets correctly and understand how to grow the wealth, even within a trust. Right, let's move on to marriage regimes. How you are married is important because how you are married will also determine how your assets are distributed. You can't will money that doesn't belong to you. If you're married in community of property, for instance, you already know that half of that joint estate belongs to your partner and the other half belongs to you. You can't want to write a will for the entire estate. It is not yours. You are jointly in ownership of that estate. So you can't bequeath monies that are not yours to maybe your children or maybe your new partner or whoever if you are still married in community of property. So your marriage regime is very important. Even if you are married in community of property with accrual, there is an accrual calculation that will need to happen. So think about the type of marriage regime you're in and make sure that it is aligned, or rather think about the type of marriage regime that you're married in, and then when you are writing your will, make the consideration of that marriage regime so that they align correctly, right? I said the third one, but I'm like literally on the next one. The next one is, of course, drafting a valid will. A valid will needs to be written, it needs to be signed, and it needs to be witnessed by two people. And those witnesses need to be valid witnesses. So you can't just write a will on a computer screen on your own and then decide you've got a will, somebody must come and find it when you are dead. No, it has to be drafted, it has to be signed, it has to be witnessed when it's signed, and you've got to have the mental state and capacity to be able to do it. So you can't force someone to write a will when they are on their deathbed and they literally have no capacity to be able to draft or write or sign or get a will witness. The person has to have the right mental capacity and legal capacity to be able to do that. And I think the last one that you've got to consider is that if you have minor children and you don't write a will where you're nominating certain guardians and they are minor, it's either you are going to die interstate, right? Or you're going to die without a will and interstate succession law will kick in. The court might need to be the ones who are going to be nominating and identifying guardians for your minor children. And their money goes into the guardian fund. And then the person that's been chosen needs to write a letter every time they need to get money out of that guardian fund. So these are some of the considerations to take when you are drafting a will, if you want that will to be that strategic estate planning tool and more than just a document that tells people how you want your money or your estate to be distributed upon your death. I'm going to leave it there. Please remember, none of my videos constitute as financial advice. If you are, however, looking for financial advice, please speak to somebody who's certified and registered with the FSCA. I'll see you guys on the next one. Mwah.